Thank you very much, Dave, and welcome everybody to this webinar on building a team out in China, a winning team out in China. And I want to start this webinar by just emphasizing from this one fact that China now produces twice as many graduates as the USA. And this really highlights how much of a talent pool now exists in China. A talent pool which is well educated, which has lots of experience of working internationally, and also has lots of experience of helping foreign companies, I think in many cases, with their China market entry and development strategies. So there is no shortage of talent to choose from if you are looking to build a team out in China, which obviously is fantastic news for international companies and foreign companies who are looking to operate out there. And so that's a great opportunity to make a success of building a team out in China. And we've seen from the many clients and companies that we have worked with what makes for a successful team out in China, what makes for a successful operation out there. There are some commonalities, I think, amongst the success stories. Firstly, a very effective use of office space is key. Office rental out in the first tier cities in China at the moment is very high and increasing all the time. And therefore, in order to build a team effectively, we'll come on to the cost of employment in a moment, but to make other overheads as efficient as possible is how you build up successfully from our experience. And so even larger companies make use of co-working spaces, perhaps in the early days before moving to their own premises. Manufacturing companies often take advantage of preferential rent agreements if they're setting up a manufacturing base with a team there, just to give them more runway when it comes to building up a team, putting aside costs for that. We find successful companies, they hire good local staff to build up their business in a variety of roles, and also importantly keep on top of salary inflation in China, which continues to be very high and a constant pressure on foreign companies operating out there. This is in contrast to the risk. And the risk is that the cost of employment overwhelms you when you start to build a business out there. So I mentioned salary inflation, I mentioned kind of, other expensive overheads. And there's one particular example for us that stands out. And it was a company from the UK who hired a very talented general manager to lead their business in Beijing, he had a budget, he went out and hired a very talented team, but the salary levels were perhaps inflated beyond what they should have been. Also had a very fancy and plush office in central Beijing. And although the team were performing well and sales were coming in, the overheads were just too much. And I think the cost of employment in particular overwhelmed them to the point where they couldn't continue and they had to exit China in the end, which was a great shame because, as I said, they had a lot of opportunity there. And this leads me to this point about the actual cost of employment in China. So if you're looking to go to China to cut costs, and I often get approached by companies who think that by going to China, in particular companies who are sourcing out in China and want a QC team out there, that they can cut costs because the cost of employment is much lower, and therefore they can outsource functions out to China and save costs for their business, which is simply not the case. It may have been the case 10, 15, 20 years ago, but certainly not now. And we've actually done a comparison, which is on the right-hand side, of our typical account-based manager from the UK compared with an account manager out in Beijing. And significantly, you'll see that actually it comes out slightly more expensive to hire the account manager in Beijing, even though you see the base salary for the Beijing-based employee, Tony in this case, is much lower than Angela, so what we've called the UK-based account manager. The significant contributions from the employer side is the Social Security and Housing Fund for the employee, which the employer has to take into consideration as the total cost of employment in China. It's something that they have to file with the local Social Security Bureau in the jurisdiction that they're operating in. Now, this is for a Beijing-based account manager. Social Security, income tax, other stipulations and costs of employment do vary slightly across different cities and different locations. This gives you a good example of what you need to consider. And often we advise companies to put aside anything from around 35% to 45% of the base salary for other costs of employment. So yeah, it's quite significant, especially compared to other economies in the West. Also, what's important to note is the number that the Chinese employee receives as part of an offer or as part of an employment contract is the number that he expects to take home, expects to arrive in his bank account every month. And this has caused confusion for many companies that we've worked with that have presumed that that is a gross figure and that the deductibles after that will result in their net figure, which will be different, obviously causing difference in expectations and disgruntled employees. So that's a key one to remember. As well as those core costs of employment, there are other costs to take into consideration, many typical and not too dissimilar to any other country you'll be operating in. So travel expenses, for example, office expenses, expenses for meals, or an allowance for meals, which is quite common, in particular to cover lunch out in China. Also, private medical insurance as well is especially common for foreign employees out in China, expats, as they often have an expectation to access a higher standard of healthcare. And just one note on travel expenses. Obviously, China is a very large country, and although travel expenses are quite reasonable, they still can add up, especially in sales or business development type roles, where they're expected to travel across the country a lot. And then some other expenses are typically Chinese, and in particular, this picture you see on the right-hand side of a hongbao or a red envelope is something that is often stuffed with cash and given out to Chinese employees during holidays, in particular around Chinese New Year. This is just an expectation from Chinese staff in particular that they'll receive this from their employer. And considering around Chinese New Year, you should expect probably revenues to dry up slightly because of the time of year and the slower pace of business. Having this additional cost can really hit your budget. So it's really important to budget for this in advance, and also, gauge what standard practice is in terms of how much to distribute to your staff over the holidays and over Chinese New Year in particular through red envelopes. So this all leads to the question of whether you actually have to employ staff in China, considering it's not as cost effective as you might think, considering the total cost of employment can be quite significant. And can you just contract individuals on a consultancy basis, for example, in China, and circumvent some of these employment regulations and requirements? The short answer to that is actually just no. And the reason for that is because in China, every individual has to be employed under an entity in China in order to pay social security and individual income tax. Unlike the UK or other Western economies, which largely work on a self-declaration model when it comes to self-employment, China is very different. So if you did want to engage a consultant, they would have to be a consultant who were employed by a company, and therefore, that company would be covering their cost of employment, i.e. social security and income tax. In the case where you're just paying an individual out in China on an ongoing basis for effective employment, that individual will be seen as avoiding tax in China. And as a foreign company, you'll also be seen as avoiding tax you should be paying out in China, and the social security contributions you should be paying for the individual, and could be blacklisted from entering into China if you decide to set up a company at some point. So those are the potential implications. And therefore, it's quite risky to effectively employ an individual in China just under a consultancy basis, especially if it's on an ongoing basis and it's seen as effective employment. And this just demonstrates that. So you need a company to employ staff in China. There are three options when it comes to employing staff in China. The first one is that you can set up a representative office, or often known as a rep office. This is for the employment of staff only, and you're restricted under this entity to be involved in any other commercial activity, i.e. you cannot receive funds from customers, you cannot contract for services or for the sale of goods in China, you can't import or export goods. It's just a vehicle for employment, effectively, and renting office space and paying other basic supplier costs. This option is also very heavily taxed. So all of the expenses, including payroll, are usually taxed at an additional 10 to 15%. Everything that goes through the entity varies upon location, but that's something you should be aware of. The second option is a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, or often known as a WFOE. This gives you a vehicle to employ staff, but also all of those other commercial activities that you might want to get involved with. Gives you the capability to perform those as well. Effectively, like your own limited liability company. It takes a bit longer to set up, not so heavily taxed. There are generally more burdensome ongoing filings and audits that needs to be conducted with a WFOE. But we often advise these days, considering the setup process has been eased somewhat, and we have another webinar on that subject on our website, that going for a WFOE is a more cost-effective option in the long run than a representative office. Or you can enter into a joint venture. It's the third common option. Partnership with a Chinese company. That's suitable for those who are in an industry that's restricted from 100% foreign investment in China. However, do be cautious about just entering into any joint venture with a partner before you have a very established relationship with them, because there is a real control risk. And we've seen many stories of joint ventures going wrong in the cases where there's a fallout and effective control is taken by the Chinese party. There is a fourth option, and that is because company registration can take a long time and the process can often get held up. You can engage a Chinese agent to employ staff on your behalf. And this Chinese agent might be a company who run Chinese employment agency service, it might be a chamber of commerce who often run such services, but effectively having an entity representing you in China as a vehicle to employ staff there. So to keep compliance, but also to keep costs down and not have high overheads or high setup costs through setting up your own entity in China. So we'll move on to how to find the right people out in China. So, it's all about building a winning team out there. So once you know which entity, which vehicle, which structure you're going to use, the next step is to decide on how you're going to find your staff in China. There are lots of commonalities with finding staff and recruiting overseas. There are some local considerations. WeChat and social media in particular now is essential with whatever you're doing in China, and it's no different when recruiting. So often there'll be lots of industry-specific groups within WeChat or subscription accounts, which you can get your CV out through in order to give you wider coverage when you're recruiting in China. It's often important to have a bilingual job description when you're hiring out in China. So Chinese as well as English. Again, to cast the net wide. It does depend upon the job requirements, but I think for most jobs, this would be recommended. So once you've identified shortlisted candidates, you need to go to the interview. And I mean, this is our personal approach to our company's approach to recruitment, to get really the broadest picture possible about the candidate. And in particular, pay attention to their answers during the interview process. So often you need to look at the background. So do they come from a state-owned enterprise? Do they come from a private company? Do they, what kind of industry do they come from? And based upon that, really ask questions around their references, around their previous employers, their strengths. Try to get past perhaps just an agreeable response that I'd say on the whole, lots of candidates might give in China, and really dig deep to make sure that they're the right person for the job. So you'll need to test the language ability if they're required to speak English, verify the work experience, and really check the quality of the information that they are giving to you during the screening and interview process. And then once you get to an offer, again, I want to highlight this point again, the total cost of employment will be much more than the salary figure that they will be expecting you to give to them. So if you offer them the equivalent to 30,000 pounds annual salary, that's the figure that they're expecting to take home. The total cost of employment may be around 40% more than that. And you'll need to take that into consideration when budgeting for employing staff in China. Also, when you're sending out offer letters, when you're putting together a contract, again, everything should be bilingual. So this is to protect you as well, as if there is a dispute further down the line, you'll need to make sure that the contract and offer letter and everything was effective. And in order to do that, it ideally needs to be in Chinese as well as English. So when you're setting up employment out in China, you need to set up some essential elements of the employment. You'll need to register the employee for social insurance. And this is often known as 5+1. And the 5 elements of social security are listed out there on the right-hand side. They cover pensions, work-related injury insurance, unemployment insurance, maternity insurance, and also medical insurance, basic medical insurance. Remember, for a lot of foreign employees, expats, they may also expect private medical insurance. And so as the social security is registered and paid for by the employers, it is your obligation to get this set up before the first date of employment. In addition to this, there is also the +1, which is the housing fund. The housing fund is a pool of money open to local employees, Chinese employees, that the employer and employee contribute to, which the employee can then use effectively as a discount for when they're applying for a mortgage. And again, if an employer fails to open employees' housing fund accounts or doesn't complete the registration to enable the contribution to the account within the deadlines, and usually just a few weeks after employment, fines between 10,000 and 50,000 RMB can be imposed. So it's important to get all of this set up. Next, you obviously need to get the employment agreement in place, the employment contract. This needs to be, again, bilingual, English and Chinese. There are certain limits with regards to probation periods that you need to be aware of. So if it's an employment contract for 1 year or less, the probation period can only be 1 month. Then that increases to 2 years, and then up to 3 years, and then over 3 years it's capped at 6 months. Need to have very clear notice periods, and we recommend for more senior members of staff having longer notice periods and putting those in place, and termination clauses as well. Again, you'll need to consult with Chinese labor law to make sure that it all lines up and it is compliant. And again, it often tallies with the length of employment, what the termination clauses should be, and what the compensation would be for the employee in the case of termination. So again, within a year, it's just 1 month salary compensation for the employee, rising by, I think, half a month's salary for subsequent years. And again, there are caps in place for it. So once you've got staff in place, once you've got everything set up, you'll need to make sure that you follow best practice when it comes to retaining staff. Just a few points here. Firstly, beware of salary inflation. I mentioned this at the start, but it is a real pressure for employers out in China. You should have a clear salary review system in place on an annual basis to make sure staff know what to expect, when to expect salary reviews and potential pay rises. And show you care and follow local customs, again, referring back to the red envelope exercise. This is important to show that as a foreign employer, you can meet the expectations of local Chinese staff, and you can keep them satisfied and engaged with the company. And this is an important point as well. So once you've got to the stage of building a team out in China, you should really get an employee handbook in place as a central reference for all of your HR policies, including around termination, including around performance, including around things like annual leave and holiday entitlement. This should be a comprehensive reference point for every employee, so there's no uncertainty around HR policies within the company. They come in very, very useful when there is a conflict or a dispute with an employee. Having an employee handbook gives you, as the employer, much more protection. And all employees must sign this when you complete it. So we recommend engaging, again, a local agent or a law firm to complete this with you to make sure it's all compliant with Chinese labor law, and get all of your staff to sign off on it. And finally, we'll finish just with 5 tips, like we always do during these bite-sized webinars. Firstly, understand that total gross cost of employment in China. Employ in China to grow your business, not to cut costs, because it doesn't make commercial sense to do that. Thirdly, figure out the best structure and entity for employment in China. Weigh up the considerations between setting up your own company or engaging an agent. Beware of salary inflation and make sure you have a process in place to protect you from it. And also protect yourself in contracts and all written policies and handbooks, like I've just mentioned. So in case of a dispute, you're well protected as an employer in China. And we have a great guide on the subject, which was completed recently by our HR experts who are based in our offices in Beijing and Shanghai, which you can download from our website, Building a Winning Team in China. If you have any other questions, happy to follow up by email.